So, happy 4th of July, everybody. I'm sure we all have lots of memories about it. I learned at a young age not to go to fireworks with hunting dogs because the sounds of fireworks just drive those dogs crazy. They come and look at me. One of them actually bit me one time because he wanted to go get some game that I had just shot, and of course I hadn't shot anything because it was just fireworks. And since then, I've always seen fireworks as kind of annoying, but I go see them every once in a while anyway. But I'm old enough to remember the 200th anniversary of this country. And I remember that because I had just bought an Opel Kadett. Anybody remember those cars? And I wanted to know how fast it could go. So I was living in Tulsa at the time, and I took it on the bridge over the Arkansas River because I figured there wouldn't be anybody running radar. You know, the cops can't sit in the water and run radar. So I opened it up over that bridge. Right at the end of the bridge was a cop with his radar on. 24 miles over the speed limit. If it had been 25, I'd have had to go to jail. And what the cop said to me was, you're going to have a hefty fine. And the fine in those days was $1 per mile over the speed limit. I had to pay a $24 fine for that. But that's the last speeding ticket I ever got. I haven't had one since. And my kids and my nieces and nephews go, how do you not get speeding tickets? I said, oh, they're really easy to avoid. Well, tell us how. I said, it's simple, don't speed. You know, but they get that. So on weekends like this, I like to think of American history, and I've been doing that all week. And I learned that 59% of Americans know that this holiday celebrates the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which means 41% don't know. And I've had to remind some people of that they did not know. But this is the day where the 13 original colonies declared independence from Britain. Prior to that, this was the head of our government, the British Parliament. And that's kind of a cool building to see. That's looking at it from across the Thames River. But it is, it's very interesting little building, but that's where our head of government would be today if we hadn't done what we did. But you know, the Revolutionary War was essentially about money. You know, wealthy people doesn't like to pay taxes. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but it was really a bunch of aristocrats who got tired of sending money to England. So the battle cry was no taxation without representation. And like I said, most of the leaders of the American Revolution were aristocracy. The soldiers who fought in it were working people. And it's interesting to note, too, in the history of our country that while George Washington was president, he owned 317 slaves, if you can imagine that. Now, even the most corrupt president today at least doesn't own slaves. But George Washington did. And at his death, they were sold. Jefferson, when he was the president, he was the third president, he owned between 130 and 220 slaves. And in his will, he said that they were going to be emancipated upon his death. But people sued his estate because he was so far in debt, and they had to sell these slaves to pay off his debts. Now, it's Thomas Jefferson who wrote the preamble to the Declaration of Independence that says, all men are created equal. And I think that's true. All men are created equal if you happen to be a white male. Otherwise, that's not true. These two guys held slaves while they were president, and their families made their fortunes off of tobacco. So basically, they were drug dealers. And you know, what this tells me is that the United States certainly has a checkered past. All white males are free, others not so much. But saying those things, I'm really grateful to be an American. I figure I won the lottery by being born a white male in America, and it is a great place to live. However, we need to recognize the transgressions of the past. You know, I was born in Iowa, which is part of the Louisiana Purchase that happened when Jefferson was president. Now, what had happened is that big chunk of green there, that's about a third of our land mass, was purchased during that time when Jefferson was president. He bought that for $15 million from the French. So if you can imagine that, trying to buy property in St. Louis, Missouri, downtown for $15 million today, be unheard of. But Iowa's a part of that, and what had happened is Jefferson had been the French ambassador before he was president, and he knew all the bigwigs in France. Napoleon came to power. He needed to fight his wars. He was running out of money, so he wanted to sell it. The French had originally taken it over from the Spanish, and the Spanish, they showed up and said to the Native Americans, "You don't live here anymore. This is ours now." And that's pretty much how that all went. I grew up on land that was taken away from Native Americans. It's kind of an interesting thing. The U.S. government, at the time of my great-grandparents, said, you can have this land really cheap, but you have to build a house on it and you have to keep the Indians off. And when I was in South Dakota, I was reading a lot about this, and it's still in the books in South Dakota that if more than 3 Native Americans come onto your property, you can shoot them because that's considered a war party. So that was legal, and that law has never been repealed. I doubt if it's enforced much, but we inherited some of that land. This plot right here is what we own. This was taken last summer, and those are soybeans growing there. And I really like that land. I'm not going to give it back, but I pay property tax on it, and I pay income tax on the rent. But I can't vote in Iowa. It's taxation without representation. I think we need another revolution. But it's there. But this ground was stolen from the Oglala Sioux Indians. The Europeans just showed up and said, you can't live here anymore. You're off to the reservation. At that time, they were pushed into Nebraska and South Dakota. Now, imagine that if you own a house and a foreign group of people comes in and says, it's not your house anymore, it's my house now. How would you respond to that? But that's essentially how America was settled, and we all have kind of joined in the hypocrisy. The chief of the Winnebago Nation right now is building 8 casinos. And he says, yeah, it's kind of fun because he says, you white Americans are so dumb. You come to our casinos, you lose all your money, and we're going to buy back the land that you stole from us with your money. And that's the plan. And that's what they're doing. They're buying up all kinds of farmland in eastern Nebraska right now. Fact of the matter is, we live in a messed up world, and we have a calling. As followers of Jesus, we have a calling to work to redeem all of culture. That's God's calling for us, because he's in the business of making things better in every area, and that's what he calls us to do. He's in the redemption business. Now, we are never going to be able to rid the world of corrupt politicians. We'll never be able to rid the world of those who want to take advantage of others, but we can influence. One of the most remarkable things about history, particularly in the last 100 years, is to realize that Adolf Hitler was elected, that he would never have come to power if he had not had the support of the German people and lots of other ones. Henry Ford of Detroit was a big contributor to Hitler's campaign. It's amazing how that's all tied together. When Hitler came to power, by the time he was done, 416,000 Americans were killed in World War II, one of which was my uncle. But we have to remember that Hitler was elected. We can make a difference in whom we vote for. And we can make a difference by not supporting bad leaders. If the German people hadn't supported Hitler, he would have just been another psychotic yelling at people on street corners. But they supported him, and that's how he got to power. Now, we can't get rid of those kind. We can't get rid of corrupt politicians, but we can refuse to support them, and we can speak out against them. And that just might be part of our calling. Today we're talking about Esther. This is the final one on Esther, and this cartoon pretty much illustrates the main themes there. It shows how a crooked king was turned around in Esther. Now, last week we talked about Queen Vashti, and King Xerxes said she had to come and dance for his guests, and she said no. So she was deposed as queen. Then they held this beauty contest, invited all the virgins of the old Babylonian kingdom, which is today the kingdom of Iran, interestingly enough. They had this beauty contest, and Esther got in it. She became a part of the king's harem, and she didn't tell anybody she was Jewish. Now, Mordecai, who's Esther's cousin, adopted Esther because she was an orphan. And Mordecai, however he did it, he foiled a plot somebody was plotting to assassinate Xerxes. And then the other character there is Haman. He was kind of like the king's chief of staff, and he was a tremendous egotist. He demanded that people bow down to him as he walked through the streets of Susa, which was the capital, which is in southwestern Iraq today. Now, Mordecai would not bow down to Haman. So Haman went to Xerxes and talked him into a decree. He said, all these Jewish exiles that are living with us, all these foreigners, they're nothing but trouble. You need to get rid of them. So what happened was Xerxes passed this decree. It hadn't been enforced yet, but he passed this decree that if you had a Jewish neighbor and killed your neighbor, you would get rewarded. Now, I don't know how many of you would kill your neighbor for 10 years off of your income tax, but you could see where that'd be tempting, especially if your neighbor has a noisy dog. But that's what was going on, and that law was going to be passed. Now, Esther, who's become queen, she was his favorite. He had hundreds of women in his harem, but she was the favorite. She never let on that she was Jewish. And, the law was you're not allowed to speak to the king unless the king requests it. If you walked into the king's presence and he didn't lower his scepter, you were done. That's capital punishment. You remember what Mordecai said to Esther. She should do this because who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just a time as this. So Esther went into the king. He lowered his scepter and told her that he would give her whatever she wants, up to half of his kingdom. And she said, I've almost got you trained. But the thing is, he did offer that. He offered it to her several times. And she requested then that the king and Haman come to a banquet she was going to throw. And they did. And Xerxes goes, well, what's your request? And she goes, we're going to have another banquet tomorrow night. Come again. And so they did. Now, Haman was really happy because he thought he was going to be honored at this banquet. And he wasn't. What had happened between the two banquets is, Esther had let him know she's going to make her request known at the second one. But that night, the king couldn't sleep. And so he decided to have the histories, the journals of his reign read to him during the night. And there he read about this thing that Mordecai did to prevent his assassination. So the next day, while the banquet's being prepared, he decides to honor Mordecai. Now, the way you honored people was they got to be led around the city on the king's horse wearing a purple robe. And Haman was sure that he was going to get that honor. But instead, Xerxes made him lead the horse around with Mordecai on the horse. So he's just boiling over with his hatred against the Jews, even more so because of that. Now, it had to be humiliating for Haman because he thought he should be honored. And then they go to the second banquet, and that's where today's narrative picks up. This is from Esther chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom. So he must have been impressed with her. And then Queen Esther replied, "If I found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared, for my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." It sounds bizarre, but those folks were accustomed to being sold as slaves. And she finally let the king know that she was Jewish. So the narrative continues like this. "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. That would be kind of scary, wouldn't it? Because the king had power to execute him right there on the spot. He got discovered. But you know, it was his ego that motivated him in the first place to kill the Jews, just because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And now he was, after this humiliation of having to honor Mordecai, he was going to be punished at the same time, as you can tell. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." You remember from last week what a eunuch is. And he talked about this 75-foot pole, which was, impaling was a normal way of executing people if you wanted to humiliate them in Xerxes' kingdom. And the Persians hadn't developed crucifixion yet, so that was what they did. This was 2,600 years ago. Now, he says that the pole is 75 feet tall, and I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. Most Old Testament scholars believe that Esther is historical fiction. Excuse me, that there actually was a Xerxes, and we can, all kinds of history books will tell you that, and there actually was an Esther, but some of the details got a little out of there. I think that because my dad built this silo in the late 60s, and that is 60 feet tall. So if you're going to think of putting a 75-foot pole up to impale people on, how in the world are you going to get them up there? That silo's in bad repair. When I was in college, my dad switched over from beef to pork because there's more money in pork. Not now, but there was then. And that silo's kind of tore up because of the windstorm that hit last summer. My dad said he kept it, even though he didn't use it anymore. He kept it because it was a good place to mount his wind vane, but the storm of last summer took the wind vane off, so I don't know how long my brother's going to keep that thing up there. But this impalement was a torturous death. It was not pleasant at all. And this Harbona says, well, Haman's the one that set this pole up. And here's the response. "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Now, this is well documented, how the Persians and what's modern Iran, how they tortured people before they impaled them. They would cut off your fingertips, your toes, things like that, and then they would cut off your ears and then put you on the pole. It was a nasty thing. And then the king gave Haman's property, which was substantial. He gave that to Esther, made Mordecai his new chief of staff, and he reversed the decree. Instead of asking neighbors to kill their Jewish neighbors, he gave the Jewish people permission to kill anybody they saw as a threat. So that was going on. It says that lots of people became Jews because of the fear at that time. Now all this was going on in March, and the festival that commemorates it, the Feast of Purim, is in March also to this day. But yeah, many people became Jews because they were afraid of getting killed. If we jump to chapter 9 of Esther, we can see how this plays out. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on those 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness and by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. See, and if you remember right, if you look at the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah, the reason that Israel was punished is because of their neglect of the poor. They were called to be a light to the nations, and instead they took advantage of poor people just like everybody else did. So this was a celebration, and they were to celebrate it with a feast, a kind of a liberation festival, kind of like a 4th of July for us. And the narrative goes on, this would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. Now, what is unique about the book of Esther is that God is not mentioned in it, not once, but he's always there, and we see him working behind the scenes. Albert Einstein famously said that a coincidence is when God prefers to remain anonymous. And that was going on here. God was working things out for those who love him for their good the whole time. And we see that kind of holy coincidences going on in the book of Esther. The narrative continues. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote another letter putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Now, Purim just means dice, because Haman used dice to determine the day that he was going to execute all the Jews. So it goes on with it like this. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the empire of Xerxes. These letters contain the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days at the appointed time, decreed both by Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther. And it's still celebrated to this day. Now, we don't live in a community where there's a large presence of Jewish people, but when I lived in Tulsa, there was 3 huge synagogues there, and I actually worked for a Jewish guy for a while. I was a delivery boy for him. But I looked online and I found this invitation to Purim for this year. This is in Brooklyn, and they do it kind of nifty. They say bison and bourbon. And boy, I tell you, I've been to Brooklyn a few times. I've never seen any buffalo running around there. But they have that. And then they celebrate with a special cookie called hamantasha, which means Haman's ears. And they look like this. And I was telling somebody about this. I won't mention your name, Heidi. But I was telling her about this, and that girl stayed up all night long making these cookies. So after the service, you can do it. Now, if you sneak out and get one while I'm talking, you're going to get sick. But you can, after the service, we can all experience Haman's ears. And these things are still eaten today as part of that celebration. You never know what you're going to learn when you come to church. How many of you knew about Haman's ears before right now? Yeah, well, Heidi did. That's where it comes from, is this celebration of the execution of Haman. So the narrative goes on. The people decided to observe this festival, just as they had decided for themselves and their descendants to establish the times of fasting and mourning. So the command of Esther confirmed the practices of Purim, and it was all written down in the records. See, God's been working the whole time, making this come about. Paul talks about that in Romans. He says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. He's always working to make things better. And he works in mysterious ways. Some people say he works in mischievous ways. But he's always working because he's in the redemption business. And he gives us the opportunity to be part of that redemption, just like Esther and Mordecai. Just probably not on such a grand scale. I don't think they're going to make cookies in your honor someday, 2,600 years later. But he's always working. And it seems he sends the right people at the right time. He's always working things out. When we needed to defeat Britain, we got George Washington. Brilliant general. Flawed human being, but a brilliant general. It was a holy coincidence. When we needed to end slavery, we got Abraham Lincoln. Again, brilliant politician, but it was a holy coincidence. When we needed to take on Hitler, we got Roosevelt and Eisenhower. They could do it, but it was a holy coincidence. Because these guys are flawed people, just like you and me. Extremely talented flawed people, but flawed people. Flawed people are called to be a part of God's plan of redemption. You're called to help. And I see this going on all the time. I see packing for hand to hand. I see serving at the supper house. I see working the food truck. These are all things that we could do to be part of the redemption process right now. Voting for politicians who aim to solve the problems of poverty and hunger. Helping out those who simply need help. Being a friend to those who simply need a friend. Taking care of those who can't take care of themselves. I see people driving people to medical services. I know a guy who teaches classes in the prison that people can actually get a bachelor's degree while they're in prison. Lots of things can be done. We just need to do it. The Festival of Purim's been going on for a long time, and the way I first learned about it is I had a Jewish employer. I was his delivery boy for a lot of years, and I got to know him. At first, when I asked him about his Jewish faith, he was quite defensive. But I said, hey, chill out, I'm just curious. And then he took me to a couple of synagogue services on Friday nights and things like that. But the interesting thing about him was he had a 74, I know I'm old, a 74 Cadillac Fleetwood. It was this huge car, 454 motor in it, for those of you who know GM Motors. And got about 7 miles to the gallon of premium fuel. And he would say when he was out of town, he would ask me to watch his condo and drive his car. I thought, man, he's got delivery trucks that are smaller than this car. And I teased him about that, and he says, yeah, well, that's because it's my Jew canoe. And that's what he called it. And he always had, along with teaching me about these Jewish festivals, he always had Scotch whiskey in his office. He liked J&B Scotch. And I said, why J&B? And he goes, oh, simple, Jewish booze. And I thought that was kind of interesting too. His last name was Schlanger, and it was an interesting business. It's Tulsa Beef and Provisions, and I delivered the meat for him, but the end provisions was actually pork. He just didn't want his Jewish buddies to know that he was selling pork. But that's how I got interested in this stuff many years ago. This Festival of Purim's been going on for 2,600 years, if you can imagine, from the time of Xerxes to now. Now, when you answer God's calling, there might not be a festival in your honor 2,600 years from now, but God will honor your efforts in making things work out for the good. And I'm blown away by how many of you are already doing this. If I'm going to summarize everything the Bible teaches, it commands us to love and to serve. And that is part of being the solution. So keep up the good work. Let's pray together, shall we? Lord, we're thankful that you give us life in the first place. And we are sorry for the days we've wasted. And now we ask that you can make it clear to us what your vision for our lives are, so that we can jump in with both feet and make good things happen. So we're thankful for that opportunity. Amen. As always, thanks again for joining us. We have 2 services on Sunday morning, and if you're in town, we'd invite you to come. One's at 9 o'clock and one's at 11 o'clock. And if you wish to support Laketon Bethel, you can go to laketonbethel.org and follow the steps there on our website. Or you can just look at this QR code, scan it in with your phone, and you can give through Secure Give, and all your gifts will go directly into our account. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.